By a show of hands, how many of you can say that you were born in the same state that you live in now? Okay, how about same city? Neighborhood? Can anyone say they've lived in the exact same house their entire life? Wow, that's actually more than I was expecting. Well, if I would have participated in that, my hand would have never been raised. You see, in my 17 years of life, I've lived in 3 states, 3 cities, 7 neighborhoods, and 10 houses. I've introduced myself to 114 new neighbors. I've driven 1,378 miles in a moving van, and I've packed and unpacked 5,064 boxes. Now, I know this may seem like a lot, but really, moving has been part of my life, and I don't think about it too much anymore. Regardless of if it's a move across the street or across the country, I'd like to consider myself a veteran mover at this point. You see, throughout all the moves in my life, my 3 siblings have always opted to stay with friends or other family during the week of the move, as to avoid having to help with the whole process. But not me. My brother even took it a step further, not even wanting to look at pictures of the new house, so that his first time seeing it would be moving day. But I was always the kid who stayed home and was of extra assistance to my parents, who were always super stressed on moving day. Whether it was helping load the truck or being the first kid to see the new house, I always found moving fun. I think this was part of my coping process. If I was able to look at the move as less of a burden and more of an adventure, then it was always less intimidating for me. This mindset was part of the coping mechanism that I've developed over the years. But this doesn't necessarily mean moving has become easy for me. The year is 2008. We're living in a townhome in Decatur, Georgia, and fun fact, this is the only house I've ever lived in that my family has owned. So naturally, I was pretty attached to it. It was a great house. We were a 2-minute walk away from a pool, a 5-minute walk away from a park, and a 10-minute walk away from some of our best friends. It was pretty awesome. But time went by, and my parents decided to sell the house. It was pretty sad for me. This was the first house that I was old enough to feel emotionally attached to, and to think I wasn't going to be living there anymore scared me. But this was a small move. We were moving less than a mile away from where we were living at the time. But it wasn't the move that scared me. It was leaving this house that I knew and loved behind. This was an important realization for me. If I could find a more meaningful way to say goodbye to these houses that I loved, maybe leaving them wouldn't be so hard. And so, from that moment on, instead of avoiding the moves by letting my parents do the heavy lifting, I started helping with the moves. I helped with every aspect: packing, labeling boxes, loading the truck, playing good music in the car ride, a very overlooked part of the move, but sometimes playing Disney music in the car didn't excite my parents too much. And then I'd help unload the truck and eventually unpack in the new house. Along the way, I'd reflect on some of my favorite memories of that house. Like, I remember one time in this specific townhouse, I was probably 5 or 6, and our family friend was staying with us for the week. My 2 younger siblings were probably taking naps, and my older sister might have been with a friend, and I remember this family friend of ours took me to our neighborhood pool. I don't know why this memory was so vivid in my mind, but I just remember thinking, wow, this is cool. I'm away from my parents. These were the types of memories that I would reflect on when I would move. One of my favorite quotes is, "Don't be sad it's over, be happy it happened." And I really took this to heart. While this quote may seem cheesy or cliche, it wasn't until I lived by it that I realized how true it can be. And it can apply to all aspects of my life. Just because you haven't lived in 10 houses in your life doesn't mean you can't change your mindset on change. Even a shift in the way you look at minor changes in your life can help you realize how true this otherwise cliche quote can be. So now we're living in what we remember as the red house. For what other reason than it had a red exterior. This house was also great, with a spread out inside and a big backyard. We were still a short walk away from a park, and even closer to our friends than we were before. But unfortunately, our time in this house was short-lived, and 1 year later, in 2009, my parents told me that we were moving to Chicago. Now, for a little bit of context, both of my parents grew up in Chicago suburbs. They had lived in their first house together in Chicago. I had plenty of family in the Midwest, and I had visited Chicago many times before. So this wasn't just an impulsive decision made by my parents, but it was scary. Mind you, I was 7 years old at the time, and while I was familiar with Chicago, to me, it was a vacation spot, not a home. But as my family went through the process of telling people we were moving and started deciding what was worthy of keeping and what we could get rid of, I noticed a trend. Every time I would tell someone that we were moving, the fear wasn't there for them. In fact, where I was scared, they were jealous. This was another important realization for me. When we are presented with something we're afraid of, it's easy to get tunnel vision and only focus on what can go wrong. But if you take a step back, look at the situation as a whole, and attempt to see it from an outsider's perspective, the tunnel vision goes away, and the bigger, more exciting picture is presented in front of you. Moving to Chicago taught me a lot about change. As opposed to spread out houses in Georgia, I now have skinny and tall townhomes in Chicago. As opposed to backyards, now I have alleyways. And as opposed to single family homes where my siblings and I can run around for hours, I now have people who live below me banging their ceilings with ends of brooms to remind my family to be quiet. But because of my changed mindset, I was able to adjust. And now I can't imagine living anywhere else. So how can you use my experience in your life? Well, when I look into this audience, I see many 15 to 18-year-old students who are potentially about to move away from home. For some of you, it'll be your first time leaving your childhood home. And for others, it'll be another tally on an endless list of moves in your life. But regardless of your prior moving experience, what's important to remember is that change should not have to be a scary disruption to your routine, but rather be important and necessary. I'm not just a good mover because I've done it so much. I'm a good mover because of this changed mindset. And it applies to every part of my life. Like, for example, a few months ago, my manager at work decided to leave her job, leaving us with a new manager. The new manager had a much different style in the way she managed, and at first it was like, whoa, I don't know if I can do this. But once I took a step back and stopped looking at the change as this disruption to my routine, but rather as a way to learn and grow from someone else's perspective, it wasn't as hard to adjust to it, and I eventually started getting used to the new manager. Change is everywhere. If you don't lean into that change, that's when it starts to affect you. Take it from me. I've moved a few times. Thank you.